I mentioned in the previous lecture the biological species concept, and we'll discuss that further today. One of the oldest questions is, how does one ancestral species become divided into two descendant species? If isolating mechanisms have not evolved at all, then the two populations will interbreed freely, and whatever other differences have evolved between them should disappear over the course of time as genetic exchange homogenizes the populations. Conversely, if the populations are completely reproductively isolated, then no genetic exchange will occur, and the two species will remain different species. If the hybrids are partly sterile or not as admirably adapted to the existing habitat as their parents, they will be at a disadvantage. Selection would favor any alleles in the parental population that prevented hybridization, because individuals that did not engage in hybridization would produce more successful offspring. The result would be the continual improvement of pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms until the two populations were completely reproductively isolated. This process is termed reinforcement because initially incomplete isolating mechanisms are reinforced by natural selection until they are completely effective. Throughout much of Europe, pied and collared flycatchers are allopatric and are terribly similar in color. However, in Central Europe, two species occur together and occasionally hybridize, producing offspring that usually have exceptionally low fertility. At those sites, the species have evolved to look vastly different from each other, and birds prefer to mate with individuals with their own species coloration. In contrast, birds from the allopatric populations prefer the allopatric color pattern. As a consequence of the color differences where the species are sympatric, the rate of hybridization is extremely low. These results indicate that when populations of the two species came into contact, natural selection led to the evolution of differences in color patterns, thus enabling birds of one species to distinguish individuals of their own species from members of the other species, producing behavioral pre-zygotic isolation. When incompletely isolated populations come together, gene flow immediately begins to occur between them. Although hybrids may be inferior, they are not completely inviable or infertile. If they were, the species would already be completely reproductively isolated. When these surviving hybrids reproduce with members of either population, they will serve as a conduit of genetic exchange from one population to the other, and the two populations will tend to lose their genetic distinctiveness. Thus, a race ensues. Can complete reproductive isolation evolve before gene flow erases the differences between the populations? Experts disagree on the likely outcome, but many consider reinforcement to be the less common outcome. The process of reinforcement is driven by natural selection, favoring the evolution of complete reproductive isolation. But reinforcement may not be common. Genetic drift in small populations, founder effects, and population bottlenecks all may lead to changes in traits that cause reproductive isolation. Given enough time, any two isolated populations will diverge because of genetic drift. In some cases, this random divergence may affect traits responsible for reproductive isolation, and speciation may occur. As populations of a species adapt to different circumstances, they likely accumulate many differences that may lead to reproductive isolation. Selection might also act directly on mating behavior. Male anolis lizards, for example, court females by extending a colorful flap of skin called a dewlap. located under their throats. The ability of one lizard to see the dewlap of another lizard depends not only on the color of the dewlap, but on the environment in which the lizards occur. A light-colored dewlap, for example, is most effective in reflecting light in a dim forest, whereas dark colors are more apparent in the bright glare of open habitats. As a result, when these lizards occupy new habitats, natural selection favors evolutionary change in dewlap color, because males whose dewlaps cannot be seen will attract few mates. But the lizards also distinguish members of their own species from other species by the color of the dewlap. Adaptive change in mating signals in new environments could, therefore, have the incidental consequence of producing reproductive isolation from populations in the ancestral environment. Speciation is a two-part process. First, initially identical populations must diverge, and second, reproductive isolation must evolve to maintain these differences. The difficulty with this process is that the homogenizing effect of gene flow between populations is constantly acting to erase any differences that may arise. Gene flow only occurs between populations that are in contact. However, and populations can become geographically isolated for a variety of reasons. Consequently, speciation is much more likely in geographically isolated populations. Marshalling data from a wide variety of organisms and localities, Ernst de Meer made a strong case for allopatric speciation as the primary means of speciation. Phenotypic differentiation in New Guinea's little paradise kingfisher is obvious in isolated island populations. Geographic isolation seems to have been an important prerequisite for the evolution of differences between populations. Natural selection may favor the evolution of increased prezygotic reproductive isolation between sympatric populations. This phenomenon is termed reinforcement, and it may lead to populations becoming completely reproductively isolated. In contrast, however, genetic exchange between populations may decrease genetic differences among populations, thus preventing speciation from occurring. Genetic drift refers to randomly generated changes in a population's genetic makeup. Isolated populations will eventually diverge because of genetic drift. Adaptation to different environments may also lead to populations becoming reproductively isolated from each other, and, in general, is a more potent force producing reproductive isolation. Sympatric speciation occurs without genetic separation, whereas allopatric speciation occurs in geographically isolated populations. Thank you for listening to that lecture on speciation and on isolating mechanisms. I shall see you again shortly.